Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sencha Cafe, and welcome back to this is Stephen Ball here speaking. I'm going to be hosting and moderating today, and joining me online is Stuart Ashworth. Morning, Stuart.
Morning, everyone.
So today we're carrying on from the previous two sessions where we've been building a modern email client and looking at how Sencha puts together the data side and the UI side. And today we're going to carry on with the final parts in that. And Stuart's going to share a little bit about what we're going to be looking at in the following week as well. So, but before we get going, as always, just want to kind of get a feel as we're 100% live. Who's online with us today, just so we can help direct the bits through today. So first of all, quick poll, what best describes your use of Sencha? So are you not using it yet, actively trialing it, using it in development, or using it in development and production? Okay, so the numbers for using it in development and production seem to be going up a little bit this week, which is great. Good number of you actively trialing it, and a few of you just trying to find out a little bit more, which is great. I say, as we go through today, please use the chat panel to post in any questions you have, and then we can try and get those answers as we go through. And just a reminder, just before we close this poll here, if you do want to have some time with Stuart on a one-to-one, then that is possible. We can certainly arrange that. Just drop us a note or email out to Patricia, who's the organizer of the event here, and we'll get you connected up. Okay, great, thank you for that. And next one here is just which version of Sencha are you using? So obviously there's going to be a few of you not quite using it yet, but let's see which versions we've got actively being used. So quite a few of you on 6, just over half of you on 7, about just under 10% on version 5, and just under 20% not using it yet, which is great that you're here to find out a bit more. And just reminded for those of you who are on version 6, there's a webinar last week that you should jump onto Bright Talk and have a look at the Sencha channel in Bright Talk, looking at the migration from 6 to 7. Now we know kind of Sencha runs on about a 2.5 year release cycle for support from previous editions. So when version 7 was released, which is almost 2.5 years ago now, we knew that was kind of a time frame that you need to start looking at moving off version 6 and up to 7. So if you're on version 6 still, it's still going to keep working, but any kind of bug fixes or updates, you need to be moving up to version 7. So definitely worth having a look at that and considering that in your strategy for the coming year. Okay, really good mix across the board there. Just under 50% using version 7. So let's hand over to Stuart and enjoy the session, guys.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. Welcome everyone this morning to the final part of building this email client application with XJS Classic toolkit. As Stephen mentioned, next week we are going to try and move on to sort of continuing the theme of building this application, but we're going to throw in the modern toolkit and build a modern toolkit interface using the same backend, the same data models, data structures, and everything. So we'll show you how to build the full universal application. So that'll be quite interesting to see how the two toolkits differ and where they are quite similar, and how we can use both of them in sync. So that's going to be coming next week. So if you're interested in modern, definitely check that out next week. It's good to see a lot of people that are using XJS already. So hopefully you've seen the last couple to see how we've got to this point. I'll go over quickly what we've done in the past 2 weeks and where we sit and how the application is set up, just so everyone's coming in with a little bit of knowledge of what we've done rather than just jumping straight in. And those who aren't using XJS just yet or trialing it, hopefully you can get a wee insight into just the way applications are built and the good things that we can do with them. So we'll jump straight in and start looking at the project. So hopefully everyone can see my screen, see some code, and it's big enough. I'll make it a wee bit bigger just in case. So as I said, we're building a universal application, although we're only focusing on the classic toolkit just now so far. So this is our application here on the left-hand side, and we've got our app folder, which has our common universal code. So in this case, we've got models to hold things like messages, labels, and contacts. And we've got stores to hold the collections of those entities. And we've got views, just one main view folder with a main controller, a view controller, which is the base for our toolkit specific controller code. And we've got a main view model, which holds all the common view model code, which is the state and things that back up the main view. And then in our classic folder, we have everything that's focusing on the interface building for the application, which in this case it's all classic stuff. And because the classic and the modern, they differ slightly, so we extend the classic toolkit components to build this classic interface. So we have our main view, which has holds everything together. It's got the main sort of border layout, and we've got a messages namespace with the grid and toolbar, and we've got a reader, which is the message display component. So we're just going to quickly jump into the browser if I close this presentation. So here's the full application. If you want to have a look at it yourself and play along with it, you can grab it on this domain, x-mail.ashersdigital.com. And so this is the application as it sits to be how we're going to build it today. So this is what we should get at the end. So mainly, we're going to focus on the compose element of the application. So far we have built the messages list here. We've added some star functionality with some action columns. We've covered some rendering, column formatting with the date. We've got detail views. We've got dynamic toolbar, which where the options change depending on the context. We've got a template here that we've merged with the message record, and we can click through that, and we can browse through the folders and see how we've got data filtering in the background, which changes the message list as we add as we swap which labels in focus. So that's what we've got so far, and today we're going to try to add the compose element. So basically we want to be able to write an email. So we've got a compose button that we're going to add. We've got this window down here, which is similar to Gmail, and what we're going to do is add a form which lets us choose a recipient from a list, which is filterable if we want to look for someone that we know. And we can add a subject, we can add a body, and we can send that email. I mean, if you were quick, you maybe saw it pop up in the drafts folder, and now it's in the we see it in the sent folder. And if we just write a subject and close it down, we'll see it pop up in the drafts folder, and we can open it up again and then delete it. So that's the sort of flow, the features we're going to add today, starting from where we left off last week. And if we have, for bonus credit, if we have a bit of time, we can add, we'll maybe add this search feature, which doesn't actually work in this version because I added it late, and it was a bit more of a nice to have if we have time. So that's what we're going to aim for today. So hopefully you can follow on. Any questions that you have during the session, please put them in the questions panel, because we'll keep an eye on that, and it's good to ask questions if if something that we're working on at the time, and I'll try and jump in and grab them. And similarly, if you want the code for the application, you can grab one from GitHub, github.com/stuart98/x-mail, and you can see all the code for this app and how it works in there, so you can follow along or check it out later on. So let's get started. So we've got, so this tab has a Sencha app watch running in the background, and we're in this sub app, which in the GitHub repo is just x-mail, but in this case I've got a sort of demo one clone of it, just because I'm building on what we did last week. So this is just a continuation of what we've got. So here's our application. As you can see, we've not got a compose button at the top, so first of all we need to add that to be able to kick off the email writing process. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into the main view here, and we're going to scroll down to this. Oh, hold on, we're in the wrong. This is the. Hold on a second, we've got the wrong folder here. Let me just swap these over. Demo gods aren't quite on side today. Here we are. So this is the main one without the container. So we want to add a container at the top of the page as a docked item, which will hold our compose button and the logo as well. So what we're going to do is, let me just, in fact, maybe it's not in there. Give me 1 second. Trying to find where we actually added this compose button. So it's in the labels tree actually, sorry. I don't know my way around the application yet. So we're going to go into the classic folder, we've got labels, and inside this namespace we've got labels tree. And at the moment we've just got the tree set up, but what we're going to add is we're going to add a docked item, and we're going to add a toolbar in it, and we're just going to add one component, which is the compose button. So I'm just going to paste that in here and I'll talk through it. So we've got docked items here, and that is a special config. We can give any number of components, and we can tell them to dock to the top, the left, or the right of the parent component, and that means that it'll sort of shunt all the other content into the middle, and we'll have these components stuck to the top. So we tell it to be docked top, sorry. The weight, actually, we don't need that anymore. So that's we can use that config to sort of decide how the docked components sort of interact with each other. So if you have a top and a left, does the top go all the way to the left and the left one butt against it, or does the left one take the whole height and then the top one continue along the top butting against it? So we don't need to do that just now, so we'll just ignore that. We've got our special spacer components to try and center the compose button. So we've got one at the top and one at the bottom. So that will create a flex component which will center the compose button. So the compose button is just an X type of button. We use the scale large, so that renders a slightly bigger button. So we can have medium or small as well, and that will change the scale of the button. The text we want is compose, and we want an icon using the font awesome set with edit, which is the little pencil. We'll give it a width of 150, and we'll just give it a simple handler, which is going to fire an event called compose raised by the labels tree, which we'll handle in the level above. So if we save that file, and if we refresh, we should see the compose button. So there we go. So that's what we've added now. And now we need to hook up this event to actually do something, because obviously at the moment that event's just going to get lost into the into the application. Nothing's going to handle it. But before we do that, so basically what we're going to do is when that event fires, we handle it. We're going to open up the compose window and form, which we will make before we hook that up. So we're going to create a new namespace in our view folder called compose, and we're going to create a new file called compose form. And I like to kind of give a hint to what type of component we're actually creating here. So if we were creating a grid, I might call it compose grid. In the other examples we've used labels tree, messages grid. I find it helpful to know what to expect from the API of the component. If it's got a wee hint to what the component is that we're extending. So that's something that I like to do. Everyone else has got their own sort of patterns for that. So we just want to X define, and we're going to use the namespace xmail .view, so it's in the view namespace, and we've got the compose namespace, which is related to that folder that we created. And now we're going to call it compose form, and we give it an object which will we can configure the component. And we're going to extend, as we said, we're going to extend the form panel, which is x.form.panel, and we'll give it an alias. We use the widget namespace, and we'll make it compose-compose form. And that, again, that's just another convention I like to use so that you can tell where in the, when you're just dealing with X types or aliases, you know where in the structure it's going to be, because it's going to be in the compose namespace, and this is the file name to look for. And this alias syntax is very similar to the X type. It's just a shorthand for that. So alias is more of a general term used for components and stores and models, and they have that namespace kind of bucket which puts the aliases in different buckets. So that's a widget, and the store has a store dot. Whereas if you want to be shorthand, you can use the X type, and it'll equate to the same thing. So that's just a wee aside. So I'm going to paste in some sort of setup code just so for speed. I know we can waste a lot of time going over this stuff. So we're going to set the default listener scope to true, and that means that any string referenced method names for handlers, for buttons and things, will be resolved to this component and not looked for in any attached view controllers for this component. So that's what we do there. We'll give it some padding, and we're going to use a V-type, a VBox layout, so that we can have the compose box, the message box, fill the screen at the bottom. So we're going to create an items array, and we're going to tell it what fields to have. So we want a text field for the subject. We'll do these first, and we're going to come back to the contacts one. And we've got an empty text of subject. We're going to bind the value property of the text field to the message record subject field, and we'll come back to where that message record comes from in a minute. And second, we need a text area for the actual message, and we'll give it a flex 1, and that will be picked up by the VBox model and say, right, the text area has got a flex of 1, so we just want it to fill up any remaining space left by the other fields. And in this case, text field has a sort of a default height, which is around 40-50 pixels. So the text area will take up any remaining space. And then on the after that, we want to have a send and a discard button. So we're going to use the docked items component config again. And I'll just paste that in from the other side. So in this case, we've got docked items, and this time we want the dock value to be bottom, because we want it to sit at the bottom of the form. We got a margin 0, that just aligns things a little bit better. And we've got an items array with 2 buttons. We've got a send button, which has a scale of medium. Again, that's similar to the compose button, had a scale of large. And we've got a handler here, which has a string of on send click, which will relate to a function that's part of this component that we'll add in a minute. And another interesting config to point out is this form bind true. So what that does is when the form will auto validates, and we've got rules in there to say that fields are mandatory. So for example, the recipients will be a mandatory field, and we'll come to that in a second. So if that field doesn't pass its validation, or any field doesn't pass its validation, this button will be disabled by default and automatically. And as the form becomes valid again, the form will enable this button, and then it'll be clickable. And we've got a spacer component again, pushes the discard button to the right hand side, and we've got an icon class to make it just have an icon with a trash can kind of symbol, and a tooltip, which is useful for seeing what it actually does without having the text, and again a string which will relate to a method that we're going to add at the bottom. So we will add those now. And what we're going to do in those handler functions is just send an event up the tree called, one called send and one called discard draft, and we're going to pass in the message record. So this is referencing the view model. That's getting the message record property. So let's add that just now, because at the moment we don't have a view model attached to this form. So what we're going to do is we're going to, at the top, we're going to use an inline view model. So in the past, in other places, we've used an explicit view model, which has its own file, its own class, extending the view model class, but this one we can, because it's just a sort of quick store, there's not really any logic in it, we can make it inline. So in the past we've used a viewModel alias here, so we could have done compose form viewModel, and that would be another file in the tree that we would make, but instead we're going to just make an inline one. So we're just going to give it an object, and we can just configure it as we would do normally. So we can make a data property and fill it with the properties we need. So in this case, we're actually going to do something a little bit clever. We're going to use the fact that the view models all cascade down one another. So if you don't have a view model property in the component that you're currently in this case message record, which isn't in our view model at the moment, it will then go up the tree of components to the parents and looking in their view models until it finds one that matches, and then it will bind to that. So that's really powerful. So you can nest components together and have them look up the tree for matching data properties. So we're going to do that here. So this message record is going to come from the parent component. So we're going to leave that as is there, but we are going to add one property called selected recipient, and we're going to use that to bind to the recipient field. And I think we need to make some data stores to back that up, because we need to load in the contacts that are going to appear in that recipients list. So let's first of all, we need to make a model for that called contact. So it's just going to be a sort of contact item, and we're going to paste in something. So we've got xmail.model.contact. We've got 3 fields: name, email, and phone. And we're going to make a store as well, which will be a collection of contacts, contacts.json, .js, sorry. And let me just paste in store definition. So here's that alias again. So there's a store sort of namespace bucket. We're going to call it contacts. We reference the model that we just made. And we're going to also load, so we want this to load as soon as the application is ready. And we're going to load it from the contacts.json file that we've got in our data folder, which is basically just a little array of made up email addresses that and names that we're going to be possible contacts in our application. So if we load our app again and we open up DevTools quickly, if we were quick enough, we weren't. Let's load it again. So we've got labels and messages loading, but we haven't actually referenced the contact store anywhere. So what we're going to do is we're going to add this to our main view model. So up here we've got our messages and our labels already in here. So we're going to add contacts. So we're going to put it to the requires array, which means that the file itself will get loaded in by the application. And we will add it as a third store. So let's call it contacts. And we're going to use the type alias called contacts. And now if we reload our application, we should see another JSON call being made. Yeah, contacts. So now that store is populated with data ready for our recipients field. So let's go back to the compose form, and we're gonna drop in our recipients field, which is going to be a combo box with various bindings added. So we'll talk through them. I'll just paste it in, and we can talk through what it's actually doing. So we've got the next type of combo box, and that is a really powerful component in the framework, which lets you have a basic drop down if you want, or it can be kind of type ahead, or it can do remote search to a back end, and we can do lots of different things with it. So it's really useful. So in this case, we're going to configure it with the display field of email. So that's the value we want to display in the drop down, and we want a value field. We're going to use the email as well. So most cases you probably have an ID that you want to store, but in this case we're just going to store email on our record. The query mode is local because it's just doing a local lookup on our store. It's not going to the back end. And allow blank is false, so that means we have to collect value from the user, otherwise the form itself is invalid, and that feeds into the form bind that we showed you earlier, which will make sure that button is disabled. And our special binding, so we're going to bind the store to the contact store that we created. We're going to bind the selection value to the selected recipient, which is this view model property we've got up here, and we're also going to bind the value to the message record that we've got in the parent view model. So the value will be the email address itself. The selection will be the record that's been selected. So that holds the entire record that's been selected. So that will give us the name and the first name and last name and the email address as well. So that's that field set up. And the last thing to do is we want to do a little bit of cleverness, because the way our messages are set up currently in the application, we want this first and last name to be shown in the message, and because we can only bind one value to our in our combo box. So at this point we're binding email, but when we show this in the lists in the grid of messages, we want to show the first and last name of the person too. So to do that, we have to extract those values ourselves. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a constructor here, so that we can just set this up when the component's created. We're going to call parent so that everything gets continues to get set up as we expect. And then we're going to grab the view model, and we're going to use the bind function again, like we've done in the other in the main view model, and we're going to bind it to the selected recipient. And we're going to bind that to a function called this.on selected recipient change, and we're going to use the scope of the component itself. And what we're going to do, I'm just going to paste this one again, and apologies for just pasting code, but it's a lot quicker and we can talk through it rather than just watching me type. So here's the on the selected recipient change method, but it has one parameter, which is the value of the view model property that has changed. So in the first load of this form, that value will be a null because there isn't anything selected. So what we have to do is if we've got a selected recipient record, we want to pull the first name, last name, and email from it. And then if we've got a message record, which we might not have when we first come into this, we want to set the first name, last name, and email on that record. And that means that we'll have the first name and the last name available in the grid when we want to show the record itself in the drafts list. So that's going to do that for us. So we can save that, and that will get us finished in this component. So that's us ready with our compose form. So the next one we want to do is we want to show this form to someone, to the user. So we want to show it in a window. So what we're going to do is, rather than just do a window on the fly, we're going to make our own subclass of the compose window, of the XJS window, called compose window. And what we're going to do is, it's going to be a simple component with one item, which is the compose form itself. So let's paste that in. So we've got name here xmail.view.compose in the same namespace as the form. .compose window. We've got an alias here if we need it. And this one we've got an inline view model as well, and this is where the message record that we referenced in the compose form is sourced. So we set it to null by default, and we've set our own custom config. And we've not really talked about configs or custom configs in the past. Basically, when we create a config like this called message record, in this case, the framework will automatically create a getter called get message record. It will create a setter called set message record, and it'll give us the option for an updater and an applier methods called update message record and apply message record. And they give us hooks to do some manipulation with the values that are coming in. And all these things like title, that is a config itself. So there's a set title method as part of the window. And things like the applier lets you modify the value before you pass it on to the next stage. So you might want to, if you get a value, you might want to strip out characters that you don't want or something like that. And the updater generally is applying the value to the component itself. So it might be that you update a component underneath, or you update in the set title case, you'd update the actual title component and draw it to the DOM. So that's the kind of the process you've got here. So we want to be able to accept a message record as a config like these are, and we want to be able to push that into the view model so that it can be used by the compose form that's the child of this. So what we do is we create an update message record. So if we don't create one here, it's just the updater doesn't exist and it just skips over that part. So it doesn't cause any errors. You don't have to have an updater. So what we want to do is take the message record. We want to grab the view model and set the view model property to be the value here. And that will give us access to that record in all our subcomponents of this class. So that's a good way to do things. And equally, it doesn't need to go into the view model. It could just be a property that you set. It might be, show form, and if that was set to true, you might dip into the items array and hide this form or something as it toggles. So that's what we've done there, and these are all just general window configs. We want it to be minimizable because we want to pop it down to the bottom. We don't want to resize it. We don't want it to be draggable. And our title wants to be new message, and we've got a layout of fit, which means that it has one child component, and that component will fill up the container regardless of the size of the window. So if the window gets really big, the compose form will expand to suit it. And the constraint properties stop the window being able to be dragged outside of the viewport. And so we've got our X type here for our one item, which is compose form. And what we're going to do here is we're going to bubble these events. So this is a clever config. So any event that we specify here that would normally stop at this point, so you could handle it on the compose form level, but we want to be able to handle it outside of the compose form. So we want it to be bindable to on the compose window itself. So we bubble the event, and that will pop it up a level. So it's effectively saying, listen for this event and fire it again with the context of this component, which is the compose window. So we'll see how that works in a minute. So we want to bubble the send event and the discard draft event. So now those are ready, we can start to trigger them and open those up to show the user. So we're going to go back to our main controller base. This is the common code for all the toolkits, and we're going to add some handling code for our compose button that we've added at the start. So let's drop in that function here. So, oops, don't want to delete that. So we've got an onCompose message, and what we want to do is create a new message model instance. So we use the x.create, pass in the message model name, and we give it some default values. So in this case, we want it to be part of the drafts folder. So we give it an array of label array with the drafts enum in, which is ID number 4, I think. We set a couple of flags. So it's an outgoing message. So rather than showing in the inbox folders, we want it to be shown only in the sort of sent folder. So we set outgoing to true, and it's a draft at the moment because we've not hit send. So we set draft to true as well. And then we pick up the messages store and we add that record to it. So in this case, in our little application, we're just throwing all the messages into one big store and using these flags to decide what goes where, what gets shown at what point. So in reality, in a bigger application, you might have a outgoing messages store or a drafts messages store as well. So you could all have these different buckets that they go into and move around as the state changes. Like as they get sent, you move it from the drafts message bucket to the sent message bucket. But in this case, we're just going to put them all in one big bucket. And we're going to call commit changes just to mark that record as not phantom. So because we're not syncing to the back end, we don't want the message store to hold on to that as an uncommitted change. So we just commit that changes manually. And then we're going to show this show compose window method, which we haven't written yet, but we will do now. So we're going to do show compose window, and in this case, we're writing this in the base class, but because this is going to be very specific to the toolkit, we don't want to actually do anything here. So we're just going to console log implement in subclass. So we want to each subclass, but in this case, there's probably going to be two. There's going to be one in the classic toolkit and one in the modern toolkit. And we want to make sure we override this method in each of those toolkits to show the window in the right way. So in this case, we're going to show a window that's going to hover on the screen. But on a modern toolkit, on a mobile app device size, you maybe want to slide a whole new full screen card over and show it that way. So the details of how the UI is shown is different. So we need to sort of diverge that code path. So we go to the main controller We've not got any code in here now, but we're going to override the show compose window, and we're going to add that there. And what we're going to do here is well, let me just grab the code because there's a bit of extra stuff to do here. So we're going to grab the, we're going to create the window, and we're going to just add this to a requires array just so we make sure we've got the right files present. And of course that has one parameter message record. Let's take this ID out. So the way we're going to add some extra functionality in a minute to handle multiple windows, because you know, you could have multiple messages going on at once. So what we're going to do is we're just going to do this simply just now, and I'll show you how we do that in a minute. So we might get a few errors first, but we'll get through that. And just to show this off, so we'll do win.show, and that will show our window. We'll make it 500 pixels high and wide. And this is the config that we set up before. So this message record is where we want you know, the new message that we've created to go into, and we want that to get bound to the form. So let's refresh this and hope everything works okay. Which it doesn't. Did we hook up that method? Let's just double check. So we've got our compose event, but we haven't actually handled that yet. So we need to go back to the main controller, the main view. And what we need to do is handle that compose event. So we've got our method and we've got our event firing, but we're not handling it. So we create a listeners object. We handle the compose event that's coming out of the labels tree from that button, and we hook it up to the on compose message method that's part of our base class. So let's refresh, and hopefully we get a message window. Perfect. So you can see it's got all the fields. We've got the recipient field, which hopefully has some options in the drop down, which it does. So we could type in there and maybe get some options. Not just now. There we go, KB. So that's the first one. So I think it's doing a very simple look up just the start of the string. So we could expand that to, you know, look anywhere in the string for the value. We've got a subject and we've got our text field. And if we click send or discard, nothing happens because those events aren't hooked up. So what we need to do now is hook up those events. So what we did in our form, if we jump back, we are raising these two events, and we're in the compose window, we're bubbling them up so they come out of the compose window. So what we need to do is where we create that, where we create the window, we need to handle those two events. So let's go back to our main controller, and we need to drop in some event handling for these two events that are coming out. So we're going to handle the send event. We use the on function, which is the which lets us attach handlers to events. So we've got the send event and the discard event, the discard draft event, and we've got the scope to say we want it to run in this. And we've done some extra work here because we want to be able to close the window after it has been sent. We want to have access to that window object, but by default, you know, there's no record of this compose window being available, you know, globally within this controller. So what we have to do is we use this x.bind function, and what that does is that you pass it in the function you want to bind, and this will tell us the scope that you want it to run in. So you can run it within a different scope than would be the natural scope. And so that's, we want it to be running in the scope of the main controller. And then the third parameter is an array of arguments that you want to push into this function, which maybe don't exist anyway. So onSendMessage has one parameter of the message that's being sent, and it has one which is the event object itself, which is details of the event. So we want to tack on another parameter to those two, which is the window itself. And the true at the end tells it to append that parameter on instead of blowing away all the others and just using this that window parameter. So now on our onSend message function, which is part of the base controller, we will add now. We'll show you how that how those parameters come through. So we've got an onSend message. I'll just pop it under here. So here's onSend message. So that's the message record that comes out of the event itself. Then we've got an E, which just has details of what the event was, when it, what fired it, etc. And now we've got our compose window reference, which is the window that this event is coming from. So that lets us do the processing and then close the window. So to do a send message, or in this case it's a fake send message, we want to take out the drafts folder label. So we take off the label of drafts and we add in the label of sent, and then we update the flags in the record. So we set draft to false, we set sent to true, and we add a date to say it was sent at this point in time. So we commit that message records. That's the same as before. We did the commit changes. Basically that just says these changes are not outstanding and needing to be synced, because we're just working locally. And now we can call the close method on the window, and that will close the message window out and let us carry on. And so we're going to do something similar with the discard drafts. If you notice, before we used the same x.bind setup for the discard draft. So there's our extra compose window parameter. So in this case, we just want to remove the message from the store, and we just want to close the window and carry on. So now if we go back to our application, refresh, we should be able to do those things. So we open the window, we can discard it, it disappears, or we can set a subject and we do send, and hopefully it shows up in here. So we've sent a message to Keen and we've got nonsense subject line. So that's in our folder. So now it's in our data store as a sent message with a date of the 17th of February, which is today. And it's summarizing it as one message. So that's us got through the process. So now we've got messages going in, and we can send them. And let's just check the discard. So if we had a subject and a recipient, we close this, we should see it in the drafts folder. So there we go. And this little red triangle means that it's not been synced to the back end. So because we don't have a back end, we're not syncing it. So we can turn that off if we wanted to. But it shows that that's a drafts message. So now we want to, when we go to the draft folder, we want to be able to click on one of these messages, but we don't want to do the default behavior, which is this, because we want to be able to edit the draft. So we need to, instead of showing the usual reader setup, we want to show the compose window again. So what we can do there is we go back to the click handling function, which is on message click. So that function is handling the click on the message grid. So if you remember from last week, we ignore the click if we're clicking the action column, which is the star. So we don't want to go into the message. And if we aren't, then we just set the selected message in the view model, and it will take care of the changing for us. But we want to be able to do slightly different logic when it's a draft to when it's an incoming mail. So what we want to do is we want to do this. So we want to check if the message is a draft. We want to do the show compose window again, and we want to pass it the message record that was being clicked, and that will pop up the window and fill in the form. Because of the bindings that we did, the form will get filled out automatically. And then if it's not draft, then we want to just carry on and set the selected message as we did before. So if we go back to our app, refresh, we can do a compose, and we'll set a subject, and then we'll close it. If we go back to drafts, we see it in the drafts folder, and we click it, and now it opens up our compose form again, and it's all pre-filled with the values that we had. and then we can either send it or we can delete the value, and that'll delete the draft from the folder. So I think, and let me just check what we were hoping to cover. There's one other thing that we haven't added, and that is, if we go back to our other one and compose, we get the drafts folder highlights how many drafts we have and bolds if it's got some. So what we need to do that is we need to include that in the so the moment these folders count the unread mail, we want to do that same check for just draft items. So if we go back to the function that does that, which is the main model, we need to go to where those are calculated. So calculate unread count. So we're going to sort of piggyback this method. It's maybe not really designed to do it in this one place. We could maybe duplicate it and do a second one, but we're just going to piggyback this just now, and I'm going to paste in a variation. So basically, this function queries the message store, says if there's a label, if there's a record that matches the label that we're currently in and it's unread, then add it to the count. If we want to also do that, but also, or is it in the drafts folder, then we want to include it in the count, regardless of its unread state. So we paste that in. So now we've got an or, and if it's got has label and it's in draft, then we want to include it in the count. So if we save that now, that's maybe a wee bit confusing, so hopefully it's made sense. So now we see drafts gets that message included in that count, and we get a V1 beside it. And then if we delete, oh, it didn't delete, so is that still there? So let's refresh now. So the last thing you maybe noticed is that these message windows appear down here on the final application, and they stack up like this when you open them, and they know that there's already one open relating to that message, so you don't get two. And if you close them, then they'll nudge across. So what I'm going to just drop in a bunch of code, which is going to be annoying, but I'll try and explain how it works. So what I've implemented to do this is something that I've called a compose window manager. So basically, it's a sort of a layer that sits between the controller code and the compose windows, and it handles tracking what messages have windows open for them and shows them and calculates the positioning. So I'm just going to quickly run through that. I know it's 10.2, so we're pretty much where we want to be. So I'll quickly run through this. So it's just extending the base class, because it doesn't need any extra code from the framework. We're requiring the compose window because we want to open the compose window from here, and it's a singleton because there's only one instance of it. We want a global instance. We've got a Windows property, which is going to be a collection of all the windows that we've opened, and we've got a property window spacing, so basically how many pixels between each window. And we're going to instantiate the Windows collection in the constructor. And now we've got our show method, which is what we're going to use when in the controller we want to say show a window for this message record. So first of all, we're going to get an ID for the message, basically just a standard ID that we can use. And we want to check whether the Windows collection has a window instance for that ID. So basically that means if there's already a window here for that message, then just open it. So we want to expand it. So that's what we do here. If we've got a window already, then expand it, and just the user can just carry on. Otherwise, we want to create it. So we can create a compose window with this sort of unique ID, and then we add some special handling to close and minimize events. This is maybe a bit confusing, but so basically close, we want to remove it from the collection of windows because we no longer want to track it. And if we minimize it, we want to, if it's already collapsed, then we want to expand it, and if it's not collapsed, then we expand it. We collapse it down to the bottom of the screen. And then there's some tricky logic to set the position of the window, because obviously it doesn't, the collapse and minimize events in the window don't actually tell you where to put it. So it will minimize it to the header, but it doesn't say put it anywhere like a window in Windows you might minimize down. So we basically get the use a function to get the position we want this window to go at based on how many other windows are there, and then we just use a set position method to put it there. So that's what that's doing. If you want to dig in closer to the code, then you grab it on the GitHub and you can have a wee look more deeply. And then we add this window to the collection of windows. And then once that's done, we show the window and we set the position. So basically, if the window is already there, then we want to show it and position it correctly, even if it's there already. So we've expanded it, we also want to show it. And then we return the window so we can do some stuff afterwards to bind to those the send events and discard events that come back from the window. So the remove method that we called before, we would just remove it from the windows array, and then we reposition all the other windows that are remaining so that they, so there's no gaps. So if you have 3 and you remove the middle one, you want the leftmost one to push into the right. So that does it there. That's the get ID, just makes a little unique string. And the get window position, which is a bit magic, but hopefully there's some comments there you can work out. Basically, it figures out how far down it needs to be and how far along the screen it needs to be. So now we can make use of that in the main controller now. So instead of this where we create the window itself, what we're going to do is we're going to use this window manager, and we're going to just drop this in here. So we call the compose window manager and we call show, and that will return our window, and we can make use of it where we want. And I'll just pop this in here as a require so we know we've got it and ready to go. And we don't need to call the show now because the manager handles that for us. Nope, wrong window. So if we refresh this, fingers crossed. So now it's docked to the bottom. I'll give it a bit more width. We compose and we minimize it, it goes there, and the next one bumps along. And if we give that a subject, you can see it actually changing. So if we close one with no subject, then the other one nudges along and takes its place. So that was just a wee bit of code to show you how I managed to get it to look a bit more like Gmail with the sort of docked message window. And I think that's us covered everything to do with the compose, and that I don't think we'll have time for the search. So you can check out the GitHub later, and I'll push the search changes up to that. As always, if there's any questions, find them in the webinar software and we can get to them. But hopefully you've enjoyed this little mini series and learned something about the framework and how I build applications, how some best practices and that sort of thing. And hopefully you can join us next week to dive into using the modern framework and expanding on this to make it a truly universal app. If you want to go and have a play with the application, it's at that URL, and the GitHub, that's the URL there in the toolbar actually. So in fact, let's put the slide back on. So thank you for coming along and listening to me and and following the sessions with me. I'll pass back to Stephen to go over any questions. Feel free to put them in. And thank you very much. We'll see you next week.
Great, thank you very much, Stuart. There's a quick question here about the recordings for the sessions. We'll make sure that we get the links sent out. We've got some temporary links at the moment. Whilst we're just trying to sort out the best place to get these uploaded at the moment, we're likely to try and get them up onto BrightTalk, but also looking at maybe trying to get them up onto YouTube as well. But we will get those links out. So yeah, please fire through any quick questions here. So one quick question here. You've kind of mentioned classic and universal. What is universal and what does it do different to classic?
So good question. The universal app we refer to a universal app, it's kind of meaning it's universal to all the different devices and form factors that you might be targeting. So classic is generally targeting desktop application, desktop devices, so big screens, mouse and keyboard kind of thing. And modern is more targeted to touch devices, so it's got full touch support, and the components are more touch friendly, and there's little animations for supporting different layouts that are more suited to touch. Generally phone applications have sort of card sort of swiping layouts, that sort of thing. So that's what each toolkit is more targeted to, and you can develop applications in isolation as one. You could just build a classic application and forget about the universalness or a modern application. But if you want to build a universal application, you can have common code that suits both a touch device sort of form factor and a desktop device form factor, and you can have that common code and then build different UI experiences on top of it. So in our applications case, what we'll do next week is we've got all the data structures and the main actions, business logic is in this app folder, which is the common code. So when we come to build our modern toolkit next week, we've got all that already there and got all that for free. So what we need to do is we just need to build a new messages list that shows the messages in a mobile friendly format, for example. But we've got the data store in place. We've got the handlers that will handle the compose event, wherever that may come from. And that's the beauty of using custom events, because in our case we've got a button here which has compose, and you click it and it shows the window. Whereas in a mobile app we might have it might be a swipe event, or it might be a button in a totally different place. But because we're dealing with custom events, we can wherever that compose event comes from, we can just handle that compose event. So it might come from a button click, it might come from you shaking the phone, anything like that. It doesn't matter, because we've abstracted that, we've abstracted the detail of where that event comes from. And that's the really good thing of using that structure of custom events. And it means we can separate out the two different UI and UX builds, because you definitely have to have a different experience on mobile to desktop. You've got more real estate, you've got a different way of interaction. So the two toolkits let us separate that and cater specifically for the right form factor. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that answers two questions that come up into the list in terms of what's the common parts between modern and classic, which are totally separate. And I think that's one of the great things here, is that the back-end business logic, the models, the interactions are written once, and then they're the same that you use everywhere. And that's the great thing about using the model view controller kind of paradigms, is that you build your model, and it's then just a case of putting the view on top of it and linking the exposed events together. So it's very, very cool from that respect.
Yeah. So just to answer that question, basically everything that doesn't have an X type is common. If that's a simplistic way to think of it. So anything that's a widget has a modern and a classic version generally. We've not got feature parity quite yet, but anything that isn't a widget will be common to both packages, both toolkits. So as Stephen said, all the data stuff, all the event modeling, all the controllers and view models, that sort of thing, they're all common.
Great, thank you, Stuart. Yeah, a few other just comments in here. Thank you for the session, great session. Really useful to see some of the practices and bits, and to actually walk through from beginning to delivery in terms of the features and how the bits kind of refactor as you're going through and adding the bits in. So that's all good. Okay, guys, I think we're top of the hour now. I think we'll let you get on with your days, and we'll look forward to kind of catching up with you next week for the next instalment, as we kind of add on the kind of the modern frameworks as well. So thank you again to Stuart, Happy coding, everyone, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks a lot. See you later, everyone.
Cheers, bye.